Hi all, let's revisit a game we did cover on this channel 10 years ago. That was the time when Rybka was a chess engine, which was quite popular. Some controversy surrounded Rybka after. In fact, there's some controversy over Houdini at the moment with TSEC. So things change. I was using an engine during the game. Today, I'm using pre-prepared analysis. And I hope I've got a little bit more insight into chess generally. So let's have a revisit of this classic game. Rashid Nezhmetdinov was playing white against Yuri Kotkov. So this was in the 1957 17th RSFSR Championship. So let's have a look. E4 from Nezhmetdinov. And we have E5. Black tries to play the opening very, very solidly. Perhaps, not wanting to play a Sicilian defence, for example, which would be more maybe up Nezhmetdinov's street tactically. So black, playing a very, very cautious Berlin defence. Knight f6 here. Nezhmetdinov castles. Knight takes e4, rook e1. Knight d6. We have knight takes e5. This leads to what seems to be, this has been played a little bit in over the board chess, but there's only one shared file, so there shouldn't be that many dynamic possibilities in theory. Black should be able to equalise, you'd think. We have knight c3, knight takes e5, rook takes, bishop f6. The rook goes back to e3. Sometimes it could be a target, you'd think, on e3, but on the other hand, it's preparing to double usefully. Maybe that's much more useful than e1 overall. We have g6, queen f3, bishop g7. Here, just to get a flavour of things, if rook e8, b3, with that one shared file, maybe you could argue white has a small edge, but if black plays carefully, it shouldn't be that much to write home about. For example, this position, white has the bishop here. White, you could argue, has a small edge. So anyway, bishop g7, we have b3, knight e8 now is played. There's no big deal at all from giving up the dark square bishop. That's something the latest Stockfish would do, Stockfish 11. Maybe not. But here, white's dark square bishop, if white did this, if black did this rather, there'd be a lot of damage and a lot of dynamic potential heading to black's king, for example, like this. So, no. Knight e8, keep the fianchettoed bishop. Bishop a3, d6, rook a e1. Knight f6. Now, maybe I think I was a bit too favourable with my evaluation 10 years ago. I said as if white's better. In fact, with c6, a precise move like c6, black should be able to soak up the dynamic pressure. There's only one shared file. It's a bit like an exchange French variation in a way. Okay, white's got a lot of pieces out. It's impressive. And the black pieces are asleep here on the back row. But if we look at this, queen g3, for example, black could consider bishop e6. What does white do? If white plays aggressively, say rook b8 here, then if h5, the queen could come out and hit h5. And looking at c3 and stuff, potentially. And giving up d6 dynamically, if bishop takes d6, then there's absolutely nothing for white. So I'm not entirely sure this position after c6, it's a difficult nut to crack, perhaps. But black played knight f6. This is a little bit more cagey, perhaps, a bit more risky. Okay, the knight might be usefully coming to g4 sometimes. It's deprived of the g4 square. If h4 as an example, then knight g4 with tempo. And giving up the exchanges is not a good idea. There's not enough there. And if the rook moved, then there's queen takes h4. So, yeah, h3 is a good move in the circumstance, just to stop any counterplay from black. Knight d7, knight d5, and now actually black plays what looks to be, a very, very loosening move in this position. Creating the sort of diagonal of death, as I now call it. This diagonal with the default king on g8, sometimes it's pretty sensitive when you move the f pawn. Black did move the f pawn, and so that diagonal immediately weakened. And there's at least two ways of exploiting that. But before we get into that, instead of f5, say c6, just to show the perils here. Knight e7 check, and bishop takes d6, just wins that pawn, and then knight takes c8, and winning even more material potentially. So if b6, then knight e7 check wins an entire rook. If knight e5, this is a really quite interesting one, which 10 years ago was actually a video insert. Actually, there's something quite nice about this position tactically going on. There's a really a juicy detail here. What would white play in this position if I give you 5 seconds to pause the video? So white to play here. What do you think is going on here? Okay, there's a nice shot with rook takes e5. I mean, this works to justify that bishop on a3 as well, of course. But, bishop takes e5 is the total disaster move. Because here, what does white play, you think? Okay, rook takes e5. And after d takes, what is the point, you think, of all this? White to play and win here. If I give you 5 seconds to pause the video. Okay, just bishop e7. Bishop e7 is winning the queen in broad daylight. The queen's only got 2 squares. Either square, there's knight f6. So queen e7, knight f6 check, winning the queen. In this line, the lesser evil decision after knight e5, rook takes e5, by the way, is d takes, not bishop takes. And, for example, bishop e7, the bishop's still there to take the knight. But it's still a very, very pleasant position for white. This is actually white getting significant advantage in this position. It's simplified, but white should have enough to try and win that, actually, here. So anyway, perhaps the most solid is in this situation is king h8, one of the more solid moves. But damage is a little bit being done already, but white can try and get this bishop to exchange off that bishop. White should have a clear advantage here as well, actually. So it did need precision from black. It seems as though, but this really makes the black position even weaker, f5. Now, to exploit this diagonal, how would you do this so-called diagonal of death? What 2 key moves would you might consider? Nezhmetdinov played one of them in the game, but what would be another? 100 points if you can guess either move. Okay, a logical move, just immediately tapping into the diagonal is bishop c4. Now, Nezhmetdinov played a more spectacular move, but bishop c4, let's just have a look for the record here. If king h8, getting off that discovered double check possibility, white can invade with rook e7, and it's really, really pleasant. If knight e5, then queen f4, and if here, then rook takes, and then knight takes c7. Yeah, there are various ways of black being completely dismantled here after knight e5. It's really quite unpleasant if, say, a6, queen f4, and then here there's bishop b2. Once the rook's on the 7th rank, looking in that common square g7, if bishop takes, then the queen can pounce in. And look, this is really quite crushing. The black king's going to get mated horribly. So, yeah, fascinating stuff. On bishop c4, this seems to be the most clinical way to play this, on that weakened diagonal. Okay, but Nezhmetdinov played another spectacular move instead. He played knight takes c7, so it makes room for the queen to come to the d5 square, and still exploiting this diagonal. We have queen takes, queen d5 check, king h8. And there's a brilliant point here. Rook e8 is played now. This is much stronger than anything else. For example, bishop takes d6. There's knight f6 counter attacking the queen, and here queen e8 should be okay for black. So rook e8 really keeps the pressure, starts pinning things. So white here is a piece down, but the black pieces are just tangled up, pinned, and spectator pieces basically. Knight f6 is played. If we look at various other tries, if knight b6, then rook takes f8, and bishop b2 check. After bishop g7, rook e8 is checkmate. So that's the sort of disaster stuff that's going on. So knight f6 is played. Nezhmetdinov plays rook takes f8. We have bishop takes. And now this very nice pin, bishop b2, bishop g7, and now a superb move here. You might not see the point here of Nezhmetdinov's play. If you look, these are spectator pieces. They're not really connected to the back row. The back row is a bit weak here. I wonder if you can guess this next move from Nezhmetdinov for 200 points. White to play here. Brilliant move. Genius. Okay, there's a lovely complementary crossfire on these two diagonals, potentially, and this move highlights that. Bishop c4. Wonderful stuff. So, just to clarify a little bit, if knight takes d5, then rook e8, that weakness of the last move is pounced on, rook e8, and it's checkmate. As b5 as an example, what is the threat? White is threatening rook e8 check to create another weakness of the last move by force, neglecting g8 if knight takes, there's queen g8, and if bishop f8, then there's queen g8 anyway, because that knight is pinned. So it's a really superb double exclam move, bishop c4, double exclamation mark. So we have actually bishop d7 being played. Now here, Nezhmetdinov doesn't play totally the perfect move. Before we get into it, what do you think the absolute perfect move is for 100 points? Can you guess how White can play this a piece down in a really, really crushing manner? It's quite remarkable. A piece down, but there's a real crusher here. Okay. The real crusher is to create even more pins, potentially. That was played in the game. Before we get into that, the real crusher is actually clinically queen f7, creating a relative pin against the queen. These are pretty handy as well as absolute pins, as this shows. So look at various defenses. For example, knight h5, we just take there, and then rook e7, and so we're hitting the bishop and threatening mate. And in fact, there's no rook g8. We can play queen takes g8. So this is just going to be mating. Let's look at this again. So on queen f7, not knight h5. Let's say rook f8. Here, can you see what White plays? Okay, don't underestimate adding some relative pins to absolute pins. Rook e8, exploiting the relative pin. So bishop takes, we just take the queen. And if rook takes, then bishop takes f6. So that's threatening to checkmate quite quickly. If rook g8, queen takes. And there's really no defense. If bishop takes, queen takes f6 is checkmate. That complementary of those two diagonals, it's wonderfully aesthetic. And if rook e7, just bishop takes g7 is checkmate. So let's have a look as well. After queen f7, if queen d8, you might ask, then rook e7. And here, if queen f8, bishop takes f6. And this leads to a position which is really, it's an endgame. Okay, black survived to an endgame. But this pawn is very, very weak. And this is dropping off. And that should be absolutely winning for White, in fact. So yeah, that was the most clinical move available in this position. Queen f7, it turns out, to add some more pin pressure, relative pin. But this move is great as well. Bishop takes f6. We have bishop takes f6, queen f7. Now, black has to play very, very carefully. He played a disaster move. Yuri Kotkov played a total disaster move, and that's been shown in many puzzles from this position. In fact, I believe queen d8 leads to a puzzle position. Before we get to that, black's last chance saloon here in this position, black has to maintain control of the e7 square, otherwise there's rook e7, and the bishop is attacked. So in fact, there's only one move which does that, bishop g5. And in fact, the strongest move for white here, a piece down. White, because of that relative pin, it's still doing very, very well here. It's a slow motion disaster for black, potentially, well, to get to a very bad endgame. But can you see the quiet move that white should play here? If the goal is just to play rook e7, okay, g3, yeah. So the possibility of nudging the bishop with h4, for example, or well, that's one of the key things. So f4 would be black's only real chance here, because h4 is coming. If for example b5 h4, and then the idea to get rook e7, that relative pin means that this rook e7 is absolutely winning. Black would have to give up the queen, because if queen g8, there's queen f6 mating. So black would have to give up the queen, and that's hopeless. So in this position, after g3, in this position, this is hopeless. So let's go with this f4 defense, h4. So this is the theoretically best play of the game. Black could try and do this, check, get the queens off, and we get an endgame which is after c3. It's still better for white, though, slightly. White should be able to win from this position. If black does this to... Apparently that's one of the better moves. The position, the endgame is still an advantage for white, though. So even with absolute best play. So anyway, but black just totally cracked up here with queen d8. So white to play and win here. A very, very cute finish. If I give you 10 seconds to pause the video, what would you play with white in this position? Okay. Rook e8. Yes, rook e8 is a beautiful move. If bishop takes, black resigned. If bishop takes, that interrupts the f8 square. Just queen f8 is checkmate. Otherwise, there's a kind of weakness of the last move. If queen takes, that's weakening f6. So queen takes f6 is checkmate. That beautiful complementary of the bishop and queen, creating that checkmate. Yeah, so wonderful stuff. Absolutely wonderful stuff here. Just take you back to that game M position, rook e8. So there's Nezhmetdinov. Yeah, his combinations it's absolutely amazing. He was prepared to be like piece down. He was confident in his positions and his combinatory ability. As Botvinnik said, look at that quotation. Nobody sees combinations like Rashid Nezhmetdinov. So that was from Mikhail Botvinnik, paying great credit to Nezhmetdinov's combinatory and tactical skills. I hope you enjoyed this game and revisiting it as much as me. And I did check out the previous video, 10 years ago. It's interesting to see, the culture at the time, the way I was doing videos at the time, and other stuff. So if you enjoyed this, you might want to challenge me for a game. Kingscrusher.tv or bit.ly/chessworld. If you register, I'll be able to invite you for a game soon after. There's also playlists at bit.ly Leela Chess or bit.ly/Magnus Carlsen Chess, etc. to check out. Okay. Comments, questions, likes, shares appreciated. Thanks very much.